Hi, this is Paul, and as often I record the Friday before for my Monday posting video. So I noticed last week in the comment section there was a little difference of opinion on what I knew and what I didn't know by that day. Things change so fast now. Last week, or this week actually, last week to you, this week for me, I went over to the Portal Discord server. I've been there a couple of times before. And there's some overlapping community between the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, where I usually visit, and just hopped into a voice chat room to lurk. I was just kind of curious what kind of things they're chatting about. I put out a tweet today that I thought Eric Weinstein is in some ways has picked up the IDW ball and is carrying it now in an important way through his podcast. The episode with Ross Douthat and now the episode with J.D. Vance, I thought both were excellent. His conversation with his brother, all quite interesting. So I know some of you are not big lovers of the Weinstein brothers, but well, there it is. I was going to do a video this week for it or against it, because we polarize on so many things, and people are people. They're mixed bags of good and bad. That's what all of us are, myself included. And so I hopped into the voice chat, and I was noticed there, and so I wasn't able to lurk, which was okay, and people apologized for that. But did a few questions, had a lovely chat, but in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, I mean, we've actually talked about that quite a bit, because the server can get quite Christian in terms of Christian conversations, talk about the Trinity or Unitarianism or on and on and on. But in a lot of other servers, I'm a pastor, and that makes people uncomfortable. There's a joke in the Netherlands about when there's a lull in the conversation, and the joke is the dominee walked by. And the idea is that, we don't talk about what we talk about when the minister comes by. And there are versions of that in America, like when someone cusses and they learn I'm a minister. Oh, pardon me, Reverend. Like pastors don't know four-letter words. Ministers occupy a strange place in our culture today. And from the view of some, we are experts in tyranny-haunted fiction. Polite secularists might see some community benefits to churches and the like. Well, we hold AA meetings, we help the poor. There's some mental health benefits, perhaps. Jesse Ventura, we give a crutch to weak people, or we offer some generic community. But the real world is the world of politics and budgets and military and power. And so the church pastors are just experts in tyranny-haunted fiction. Now, a couple of books are important in this and have become the center, actually, for those of you not following a lot of pastor conversations. Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, is a staple in pastoral and clergy conversations of a certain variety. And just recently, Andrew Root teaches at Luther Seminary. I don't know where Luther Seminary is. Did a little bit of looking at that seminary. Andrew Root he's written some really good books on youth ministry. Very interesting writer. Has an amazing book on children of divorce. And has started a series now, sort of following Taylor, on the secular age. And the second book is entitled The Pastor in a Secular Age, and later in this video I plan to read significantly from the first chapter. This past week I did a video on Caputo's subtraction story, and the idea, as it's commonly told, is that the Enlightenment liberated Europe from ignorance and tyranny, and you'll hear that from Sam Harris. See, now that I'm thinking about the guy's name, Steven Pinker. You'll hear that from Steven Pinker. You'll hear that from many people. And that sort of leaves pastors in a strange place. A pastor, if conservative enough, is sort of like someone wearing a swastika or Confederate flag to some. He no longer poses a threat, but it's kind of an ugly thing to be reminded of. And you sometimes get the sense of that as a pastor. Not really in the black community. The black community when people find out I'm a pastor, they'll want to know what title I prefer so they can use my title. Black folks often are very considerate, and many of, especially the older they are, because they were brought up in the South and they were brought up to respect authority. And if you listen to my sermon last week on First Peter, I just finished recording the rough draft, where Peter tells slaves to be subject to their masters. Well, that's a controversial passage, and I don't go into the discussion of that in the abolition movement. This morning, I caught a very interesting video that Bishop Barron just released on the Governor Cuomo and the nature of God. And for those of you who don't know, Bishop Barron isn't just a priest on YouTube. He is a serious academic. And if you don't believe me, read this book that I've talked about and some of the quotes from him in this book. Barron is a far better educated man than I am, and he knows his stuff. And Cuomo's saying God didn't do this, we did, touched a nerve in Bishop Barron, and Bishop Barron, I think, laid it out. But what is interesting to me is that, in fact, what he laid out sounds so strange to us, because a lot of the dynamics of God number one and God number two that I've talked about in past videos, God number two is all Sam Harris recognizes. So when Jordan Peterson comes along and basically lays out God number one, everybody scratches their head, unless you have some really advanced degree in historical theology that's been kept alive, and you actually have some understanding of the way people talked about God 500 years ago. And that's part of the point of Charles Taylor's book, because, well, I'll read some of that book too. The question is not, is there a God? Imagining that God is the most powerful of all beings, as Bishop Barron said. God is not a being. And God is not simply being itself. He's the ground of all being. And Bishop Barron mentioned the Roman Catholic liturgy, but that liturgy, like many liturgies, comes right out of Scripture. In him we live and move and have our being, where Paul quotes a pagan poet. So in other words, this idea of what we mean by the word God was commonly known and assumed throughout the world, but has gotten so far from us that a guy like Governor Cuomo, who was raised probably at least marginally Catholic, doesn't have any understanding. So I could understand a bishop in the Roman Catholic Church feeling a little annoyed at someone who probably had some degree of catechesis missing it completely. But I'll give Governor Cuomo a pass on this, because I don't think any of my catechism teachers thought in this. And when we read elements of the Heidelberg Catechism or the Belgian Confession in my own tradition, and when we encounter this strange language about God, and sometimes these offensive notions about God, that God brings fat years and lean years, seed time and harvest, and that God is somehow in this, well, no. So the way Governor Cuomo talked about God has become the majority assumption in the culture. And Bishop Barron, though he's a bishop in the Roman Catholic Church, though he has a YouTube channel with 300,000 subscribers, though he makes a very sophisticated theological point in that video, isn't going to make a dent in the change in the language that we're seeing. Now, last week, Monday's video was about Peter Thiel, and I'm continuing to do some work on that. I'm always working on way too many videos at once, and so some of these series that some of you are afraid I've abandoned, well, you have grounds for fear, but I haven't necessarily abandoned them in my mind. There's a conversation in 2014 that many of you sent to me when I started talking about Peter Thiel, because this was Peter Thiel and Ross Douthat and N.T. Wright talking about a whole bunch of things. And in fact, some of these conversations that have been fairly new to me now, they were having in 2014. And I didn't know it. I didn't appreciate it. I didn't realize it. I didn't know who Peter Thiel was until fairly recently. So I want to play some of that conversation, but notice the questions and notice the answers.
Another one.
We've touched on belief in God in many dimensions, but not on whether this potential God is objectively a reality or not. So the question was, what is your personal belief in God, and how does it guide your decisions?
Now, this is a standard question, and this has been a standard question through the 20th century. But if you, again, look at Charles Taylor's book, you got to go back 500 years to find us asking a question like this. Now, Ross Douthat is a well-known public Roman Catholic. Everybody assumes he believes in God. N.T. Wright is a prominent conservative New Testament theologian. Everybody imagines he believes in God. They really want to know what Peter Thiel believes. But here's the question.
I guess I put most of my cards on the table already this evening. But I mean, the one thing to add to what I've said already is that the word God has been a question mark in contemporary culture, and many people think.
Now, right there, the word God has been a question mark, and we're going to jump a little bit ahead to 2016, 2017, 2018. Everybody wanting to know if Jordan Peterson believes in God, and his answer to the question. Looking at his answer after 2+ years of video and after coming to the point in my own mental journey that has gone through these videos, I'm much more comfortable with Jordan Peterson's answer than I was 2 years ago.
They know if there is a God, we know what he'd be like because of stuff they heard when they were young or whatever. And in my own belief, experience, practice, the word God systematically gets reformed around Jesus again and again, which is difficult, as it's a reforming which takes place in one's whole life. And so Jesus becomes the focus, and we discover who God is by looking at him. But that is difficult. It's a lifelong process. It's not just intellect, it's not just emotion, it's not just bodily, it's all of them.
Now, in listening to N.T. Wright talk, I can't help but think about Sam, our resident Unitarian, who's been on the channel a couple of times, and I played a video of him and talking with Brett Sockold. The word God has changed dramatically from the time of the patristics in terms of how, this is exactly what N.T. Wright is addressing. And if you can no longer call Jesus God now, well, that comes into this conversation too.
And so the God project, as it were, is something which I think every generation has to be challenged by, because every generation, certainly in my culture and I suspect in America, starts with the assumption we know who God is, and then we try and fit everything into that.
Well, and quite frankly, I think N.T. Wright is actually underselling it here. We know, we have huge assumptions about what we are talking about when we use the word. And I think, again, it was Jordan Peterson that kind of came up and on a very public stage said, this is what I mean by the word, what I call God number one. And Sam Harris hears that and says, that's not God. And he gives some weak answer about a ghost. No, Sam, you're just living in your bubble. And you don't understand what the whole conversation around this word has been doing for all this time.
And then we decide whether we believe in this God or not. And again, when you look at Jesus, it really does change that, and change, therefore, how you see all the sort of practical issues that we've been discussing in the light of that.
I think it is. It always has a sort of very Trinitarian conception in a Christian worldview, where it is somehow it's relational, and this sort of image of God as the supreme introvert who is completely satisfied on his own.
Aristotle.
And is sort of this unmoved mover of Aristotle is, I think, sort of a very different picture. And so it's worth, I think it's always worth contrasting the sort of a great introvert of the unmoved mover with with this idea of God who shares in the hopes and sufferings of his creatures.
So the Christian God is an extrovert?
Not a total introvert.
Not a total introvert.
We don't want to be against people who are introverts, but...
Okay.
Would you say that you believe in God?
See, now Ross turns and asks the question. And again, I think in some ways this question is a leftover from the Cold War, because that became the rallying cry in the 1950s. Now, increasingly, this journey that I'm on is dragging me through the 50s and the 60s, and you're going to see that in this video when I get to Marsden's Twilight of the American Enlightenment. It's always dangerous to do history that's too close to you, but we're getting far enough away from the mid-20th century that we're starting to be able to do some profitable history. But I think it's helpful to recognize that this question is a leftover from the Cold War.
Yes, although I think it's a tricky question to answer, because you then have the question of who is God, and
again, I would argue, what is God? Because and believe you me, I'm not saying God is impersonal, but the category of what we're dealing with that Bishop Barron reacted to, that's what we're dealing with here.
That's probably, I think, the question of, who is God is more important than does God exist.
I think that's fair. What would you say is your biggest problem with the way the conception of God is understood, either by religious believers or by the culture as a whole? You can pick either one.
Well, I think often we get mistaken conceptions when people on opposite sides agree on things. That's when you get the really mistaken conceptions.
Now, that point that he made right there, that is exactly one of C.S. Lewis's points, that when C.S. Lewis went back and read history of people fighting each other, noticed how many times there were wholesale assumptions on both sides that we no longer share, which to us look like much bigger issues of battle than they looked at, even though they were battling over something that we might imagine was insignificant. So, Peter Thiel makes a point there that actually it's a very astute point.
And I think there's sort of this convergence between fundamentalism and atheism, where you view God as fundamentally a violent being, sort of a totalitarian dictator, or or some sort of demon or something like that. And I think the conception of God as fundamentally violent is this mistake that people at both extremes in the culture wars share. They disagree on sort of secondary questions like whether or not God exists. They agree on the most important thing, that God's really violent.
I'm not going to deal with the latter part of his answer there, because that opens up a whole nother can of worms, and obviously Rene Girard and a lot of the stuff that he's dealing with is looking behind there. But I thought it was very interesting that in 2014, we're already getting a sense of the question, do you believe in God, is changing into, what do you mean by this word God? And I'm not going to play the video, but this very much puts us in, reminds me of 2016 to 2019, all of the questions about Jordan Peterson and God. Do you believe in God? Well, I am not going to subscribe to that, because I don't know what you mean by believe, and I don't know what you mean by God. And that was his standard answer until basically people just kept hounding him. But by answering that question, in a sense, you're thrown back into, do you believe in God number two? Now, obviously, to the best of my knowledge, neither Jordan Peterson nor Sam Harris have watched any of my videos about this. And when I'd say God number one and God number two, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. And so then finally, Jordan Peterson, I think it was in Sydney, and he made a video about it. And I'm not sure his attempt to answer it in Sydney revealed everything that's going on in this. I think his intuitions, and this is almost always true of all of us, his intuitions are ahead of his consciousness congressman that's working the lips. I know that's certainly true of me, and this is pretty much normal. So Peterson is right in answering the question this way, I think. And again, this shows difference in my, sometimes I think, well, because I keep changing my mind on things, maybe I should take down my old videos because, I'm not monetized. They don't make me any money or nothing like that. But no, if in all fairness, I should, as in math classes I used to be in college and high school, I should show my work. And so what these videos are is in many ways showing my work. Now I want to get into Charles Taylor's introduction because Charles Taylor has become a really important figure in this conversation in the church world and outside of this church world too. John Vervaeke deals with Charles Taylor, and so I want to read some of the introduction of Charles Taylor's book, Secular Age. It's a big book. What does it mean to say we live in a secular age? Almost anyone would agree that in some sense we do. We who live in the West, or perhaps Northwest, or otherwise put North Atlantic world, although secularity, Taylor's incredibly wordy, which is why his book is so enormously huge. Although secularity extends also partially and in different ways beyond the world, and the judgment of secularity seems hard to resist when we compare these societies with anything else in human history, that is, with almost all of contemporary societies, in other words, Islamic countries, India, Africa, on one hand, and the rest of humanity, Atlantic or otherwise, on the other. But it's not so clear in what this secularity consists. There are two big candidates for the characterization, or perhaps better, families of candidates. The first concentrates on the common institutions and practices, most obviously but not only the state. The difference would then consist in this, that whereas political organization of all pre-modern societies was in some ways connected to, based on, guaranteed by some faith in or adherence to God. Now, Taylor isn't necessarily dealing with theology here. The theology would be talking about, what do we mean by this word God? Let's up the resolution. So that lack of definition haunts this book, especially for this conversation. So, or some notion of ultimate reality. The modern Western state is free from this connection, thanks to the American experiment, okay, and to a degree the French Revolution. Churches are now separate from political structures, with a couple of exceptions in Britain and in Scandinavian countries, which are so low-key and undemanding that as to not really constitute an exception. Religion, or its absence, is largely a private matter. The political society is seen as that of believers of all stripes and non-believers alike. Put it another way, in our secular societies, you can engage fully in politics without ever encountering God, or at least that word. That is, coming to a point where the crucial importance of the God of Abraham for this whole enterprise is brought home forcefully and unmistakably. A few moments of vestigial ritual or prayer barely constitute such an encounter today. They still open government meetings with prayer, including in Washington, D.C., or football games with prayer in public schools. The few moments of vestigial ritual or prayer barely constitutes an encounter today, but this would have been inescapable in earlier centuries of Christendom. This way of putting it allows us to see that more than the state is involved in this change. If we go back a few centuries in our civilization, we see that God was present in the above sense in a whole host of social practices, not just the political, and at all levels of society. For example, when the functioning mode of local government was the parish, and the parish was still primarily a community of prayer, and when guilds maintained a ritual life that was more than pro forma, or when the only modes in which the society and all its components could display itself to itself were religious feasts, like, for instance, the Corpus Christi procession. In those societies, you couldn't engage in any kind of public activity without, quote, encountering God, unquote, in the above sense. But the situation is totally different today. And if you go back even farther in human history, you come to archaic societies in which the whole set of distinctions we make between the religious, political, economic, social, etc. aspects of our society cease to make sense. In these earlier societies, religion was everywhere, was interwoven with everything, and in no sense constituted a separate sphere of its own. One understanding of secularity is then in the terms of public spaces. These have been allegedly emptied of God or in any reference to ultimate reality. See, now he's he's equating God with ultimate reality. And again, by virtue of what I've been doing, I notice this more. It's more salient to me. Or taken from another side, as we function within various spheres of activity, economic, political, cultural, educational, professional, recreational, the norms and principles we follow, the deliberations we engage in, generally don't refer us to God or to any religious beliefs, or I would argue, beliefs that we identify as religious, because, again, I would assert, and if you followed my videos, that religion is all over the place, just like Tolkien is all over Middle-earth. You're not going to avoid it. It's founded on it, but we don't identify it as religious, so our filters are different. And this is why when I was in the Portal Discord and we started talking about the kinds of religious topics that religious people would ask a pastor, I feel a little uncomfortable because I know that there's a lot of other people in that audience who are getting very nervous very quickly, sort of the way some of us might feel if we were in an Islamic country and, that which is or isn't in accordance with the teachings of Muhammad might make some of us feel uncomfortable. The considerations we act on are internal to the rationality, in quotes, of each sphere. Maximum gain within the economy, the greatest benefit of the greatest number in the political area, and so on. This is in striking contrast to earlier periods when Christian faith laid down authoritative prescriptions, often through the mouths of clergy, which could not be easily ignored in any of these domains, such as the ban on usury or the obligation to enforce orthodoxy. But whether we see this, and this gets into, ministers showing up are sort of like someone showing up with a Confederate flag or a swastika on their clothing. We might not fear the symbol, but we find the symbol disturbing, annoying, and perhaps a bit ugly. But whether we see this in terms of prescriptions or in terms of ritual or ceremonial presence, this emptying of religion from autonomous social spheres is, of course, compatible with the vast majority of people still believing in God and practicing their religion vigorously. The case of communist Poland springs to mind. This is perhaps a bit of a red herring because the public secularity was imposed there by a dictatorial and unpopular regime. But the United States is rather striking in this regard. One of the earliest societies to separate church and state, it is also the Western society with the highest statistics of religious belief and practice. And yet, this is the issue that people often want to get at when they speak of our times as secular, and contrast them nostalgically or with relief with earlier ages of faith or piety. This is the second meaning secularity consists, in the falling off of religious belief and practice, in people turning away from God or practices that speak of God or make requests of God, and no longer going to church. In this sense, the countries of Western Europe have mainly become secular, even those who retain the vestigial public reference to God in public space. Now, I believe that an examination of this age as secular is worth taking up in a third sense, closely related to the second and not without connection to the first. This would focus on the condition of belief. The shift in secularity. Now, again, when we say belief, I'm reading this. I first read through much of this book before encountering Vervaeke, before encountering Peterson. So belief now has become a much more complex word for me. Belief both in terms of trust, which would be participatory or perspectival, or modes of credo, which would be propositional. The shift to secularity in this sense consists, among other things, of a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among many, and frequently not the easiest to embrace. So when Peter Thiel talks to Eric Metaxas and says, Peter Thiel in an interview with George Packer that is well worth reading in the New Yorker, see, I've done a bit of homework, talks about this. And that's the interview that Eric Metaxas brings up in that conversation. And Peter Thiel mentions, I mentioned that I believed in God, and I thought that was radical enough. I didn't feel the need to push it. Okay? In this meaning, as again in sense 2, at least many milieu in the United States are secularized, and I would argue that the United States as a whole is. Clear contrast cases today would be the majority of Muslim societies or the milieu in which the vast majority of Indians live, India. It wouldn't matter if one showed that the statistics for church or synagogue attendance in the U.S. or other regions approach those of mosque or Friday mosque attendance in, let's say, Pakistan or Jordan, or this plus daily prayer. That would be evidence towards classing these societies in the same sense as number 2. Nevertheless, it seems to me evident that there are big differences between these societies in what it is to believe. So now we're getting into this question that Peterson pushes. What do you mean by belief? Stemming in part from the fact that belief is an option, and that some sense an embattled option in the Christian or post-Christian society, and not yet in the Muslim one. So what I want to do is examine our society as secular in the third sense, which I should perhaps encapsulate in this way. The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it is virtually impossible not to believe in God. And in fact, that society, it comes up regularly that presidential candidates won't say they don't believe in God. And I think this also is a leftover from the Cold War, even though atheists feel it particularly galling. The idea that if a president says they don't believe in God, then they can still get elected. I don't think that has the same sense that it did before 9/11, or definitely not before the end of the Cold War. So I'll start the paragraph again. So what I want to do is examine our society as secular in this third sense, which I could perhaps encapsulate in this way. The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. I may find it inconceivable that I would abandon my faith, but there are others, including possibly some very close to me, whose way of life I cannot in all honesty just dismiss as depraved or blind or unworthy, who have no faith, at least not in God. These are the deconstructions of Rhett and Link and this whole other area of the conversation that I've been promoting. Or at least not in God or the transcendent, which is sort of sometimes this swap word for God. Belief in God is no longer axiomatic. There are alternatives, and this will also likely mean that at least in certain milieu, it may be hard to sustain one's faith. there will be people who feel bound to give it up, even though they mourn its loss. This has been a recognizable experience in our societies, at least since the mid-19th century. There will be many others to whom faith has never seemed an eligible possibility. There are certainly millions today of whom this is true. Secularity, in this sense, is a matter of the whole context of understanding in which our moral, spiritual, or religious experience and search takes place. Carl protested Julian and my assertion that Jordan Peterson is a postmodern classical liberal, and that meaning that Jordan Peterson is embedded in a postmodern context in which his classical liberality has a different sense than, let's say, it would have had for Adam Smith. And the change we are talking about has everything to do with the change here that Charles Taylor is about to spend 800 or so pages trying to understand better. So in that sense, maybe my endless hours of video contributions to YouTube and podcast world stand in alignment with Charles Taylor's 800 pages. It's the context of understanding here. I mean, both matters that will probably have to have been explicitly formulated by almost everyone, such as the plurality of options, and some which form the implicit, largely unfocused background of this experience and search. It's pre-ontology, to use Heideggerian terms. In an age or society would then be secular or not in virtue of the conditions of experiences of and search for the spiritual. And we're going to talk more about that word today. Obviously, where it stood in this dimension would have a lot to do with how secular it was in the second sense, which in turn turns on levels of belief and practice. But there is no simple correlation between the two, as in the case the U.S. shows. As for the first sense, which concerns public space, this may be uncorrelated by both the others, as might be argued for the case of India. Now, of course, with, what's his name, Modi, the current, there's a research. See, this is actually it's happening in India too, the discussion of it. And this is where, again, Tom Holland's work comes in. But I will maintain that, in fact, in the Western case, the shift to public secularity has been part of what helped to bring on a secular age in my third sense. In other words, by no longer talking about God, the change in the definition of God happened in the zeitgeist in a way we weren't paying attention to. Hence that moment in Vancouver 1 between Jordan Peterson, God number 1, and God number 2. Now, if you want to know God number 1 and God number 2, the Bridges of Meaning Discord created a Paul Vanderkla intellectual deep web glossary. And in it, you can find terms coined by me in my videos. And what's really helpful to me is, as I mentioned so on Friday mornings, Pacific time from 10 to 12, I'm spending them in the Discord voice chat on the Bridges of Meaning Discord. And you can find the link to that server in the notes below. And of course, for some of you, Discord is a foreign country, and you're perfectly excused not to get involved with that whole group of individuals who are active in that community. But what's helpful to me is to hear my ideas coming back so I can actually know what's getting through, what's interesting, what's helpful, and then to be able to continue to work on these ideas. But again, it's that moment when Jordan's reading his Surface book there on the stage with Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein at Vancouver 1 that, when Jordan Peterson talks about God and when Sam Harris talks about God, there's a reason they're talking past each other. Sam Harris, I don't know that he minds talking past people, but that was the moment. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, Eric, I think, has in some ways now being at the end of the wave number 1 with Jordan Peterson in what I call the trough, Hopefully there'll be another wave, and we'll see how big it is from Jordan Peterson when he's healthy and publishes his book and all of these things. Eric Weinstein has, I think, with his portal, beginning to step into the gap in a substantive and serious way. I was skeptical when I saw the portal launch, and I haven't listened to all of the podcasts yet. I probably will now that he's more fixed in my salience targeting hairs. Eric Weinstein has been I mentioned in the Discord server this morning that one of the things that both Eric and Jordan have in common is they're raising their voice in a way that is getting attention because they're stepping out of a certain degree of conformity in how people are supposed to talk. The COVID-19 pandemic is part of this, and themes that Eric has been making for a while, just like maybe the Trump election and Bill C-16 was the warm weather of the Caribbean that brought together the elements of the Jordan Peterson storm. It could be that COVID-19 will now bring Eric and Brett to the fore. We will see. But when a periodical like The Atlantic says that America is acting like a failed state, well, Eric's been yelling that for a while. And maybe the man and the moment will find each other now. Elon Musk yells out on Twitter, "Free America now." Eric says, this is the wrong message in my opinion. The correct message is get an actual adult to explain where we are with an actual plan without lying to gain, and the second part is key, without lying to gain our compliance, the esoteric versus the exoteric. Given the loss of freedom demanded, consequences to food security and risks of damage to the world via conflict. Because quite honestly, things are going to break hard. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. We'll see. Prognostication has its own risks. No one in power is making sense or looking smart. This is entirely unsustainable. There are no adults anywhere in Washington, D.C. at all. Well, I'll hold my tongue. And, all fairness to Scott Adams, because I've been, paying attention to Scott, not as much to some of the others, but Scott Adams has, right from the start, been talking about options in sense making. And in some ways, this perhaps is echoing some of what Charles Taylor noted in that the breakdown is perhaps to a point now that the delta and the gulf in sense making between different communities is getting to such a degree that the scary thing is whether a nation state can be maintained. These are the questions that Jordan and Eric were dealing with, basically within the context of the social justice wars. But now in COVID, suddenly it all seems to get a little bit more real. Again, perhaps, we'll see. And yet I've criticized Eric for avoiding religion, and I was going to play it, but I couldn't find it exactly. When he deals with Jesus smuggling in the Douthit interview, that was very helpful for me for much better understanding where Eric is coming from. But Eric is very much living in a secular paradigm, and in some ways, like his brother, is somewhere between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And again, I think Peterson covered this area better, and I think was both rewarded for it and took hits for it. Now, on Twitter today, someone piped up with Ben Shapiro's name. The problem I have with Ben is that he's primarily, now I haven't read his book, but he Dennis Prager, and I think now especially Dave Rubin, have sort of become, now when I say decadent here, I don't mean that with all of its moral overtones, but I mean it in terms of the Ross Douthat. They've sort of become Cold War decadents. And they're not, I don't think, and that's where I would differentiate them from Jordan. Jordan is tapping into far older things. So this is really hard, and even though these videos are all rough drafts, this is really, really rough stuff. And so Eric is willing to, again, I said to Esther, so Eric brings on a rabbi, and I listened to that, and modernism. Come on, Eric. Pay attention. Listen to Jordan. The conversation is past the postmodern Christianity that Caputo is mentioning. We're moving beyond that, and we're going to have to come to serious terms with religion and politics and their relationship. And I'm going to get into that in a couple more of the books that I'm going to be reading from. Now, in this time of pandemic, Eric is out there clanging a pan and saying, "No more time, boys and girls. The pandemic has ended these 75 years of peace, and it's time to get serious or pay real costs." And he's talking about competence. And against competence has been a really important part of this conversation. Go back to Jordan Peterson talking with Roger Scruton about the fact that the social justice conversation left no room for competence, which deeply irked the scientific community in, what science is supposed to be all about, gaining knowledge through competence. And technology is supposed to be all about applying science to the real world in order to achieve competence. But if we again look back to the dichotomy between the manifest image and the scientific image, science might help you figure out how plumbing can be done, but science won't tell you where to lay the plumbing. Okay? And when it comes to governance, the kinds of things that Eric has now decided, he doesn't care who gets upset. It's time for this man to raise Cain, which he's gathered a following. And when I asked the group in the Portal Discord, what do you like about Eric? He's honest. Okay, what's he honest about? That was harder for them to answer, at least harder for them to come to consensus about. But we're to the point that something isn't working and we don't know what, and we should deal with it. And now, because of the pandemic, we don't know what the cost of things not working may become. But what we're really talking about is this word spiritual. Now, if you've watched enough of my conversations, you know that if someone kind of aimlessly throws out that word, I'm going to call them on it and say, what exactly do you mean by that word? And the vast majority of people look at me like, well, you're a pastor, you should know what spiritual means. Oh, no. Don't throw God or spiritual or any of these words out to me and assume that you and I necessarily believe the same thing about it. So after all of this time, I'm going to throw out at least a low-resolution definition of this word. Spiritual is basically the word we use to describe what motivates and moves principalities and powers. And now I just threw in another word that is going to really unnerve you. Well, what are the principalities and powers? Uncle Sam is a principality and power. Go look up Jonathan Peugeot's Santa Claus. Does Santa Claus exist? Santa Claus is his favorite example. Mine is Uncle Sam. Does Uncle Sam exist? Well, depends what you mean by exist. Yeah, Uncle Sam is real enough to make you pay your taxes. Uncle Sam is real enough to make you think about the speed limit. And now the performance of Uncle Sam and his competence is real enough to mean, well, How many people are going to get this infection? How many people in nursing homes are going to die by this infection? Is the food chain going to be disrupted? What does it mean if we euthanize a generation of hogs? What will that mean for food supply in a system that we have been tinkering and tinkering to the height of efficiency, and not listen to a guy like Nassim Taleb who's saying all that efficiency that you fine-tuned your systems to, now suddenly when things get a little bit bumpy, that efficiency is no longer an asset but a liability. And what you really need is competence. And competence in a complex, yes, Carl, I can thank you for that. Competence in a complex world is tougher than plumbing. And spiritual is basically the word we use to describe what motivates and moves principalities and powers like Uncle Sam. Now, in these last recent videos, and I find, boy, we've been having these conversations back to 2014, but I wasn't ready for them. The ceiling is religious in nature to the spiritual. We fundamentally don't understand how human beings are able to be productive in groups without understanding this word spiritual. To the degree that America as a conceptualization and Uncle Sam acts has everything to do with the spiritual and what people believe. One of the things that I noted in the Peter Thiel Eric Metaxas conversation, I'm not pulling up all these clips because I've got so many of them and it would take so much time, and this video is already going to probably be record breaking. One of the things that Eric Metaxas comes through in there is, I don't think these people love America. I've heard that complaint for years on the right and the left, that I don't believe people on the left love America. Well, Eric, I didn't put the tweet in, Eric, today, people said, Eric, would you serve your country? And he'd say, I definitely serve my country. And in fact, Eric believes that the noise he is making is in service of his country. And this is part of the difference between the right and the left in terms of, I would say, authority and critique. So, there's all these, the authoritarian and libertarian. Eric is more on the libertarian side as the left is. The right is a little bit more towards authoritarian. The right is more about strength. The left is more about kindness. These are these values that are floating around in there. But the spiritual is blocked from the conversation because we don't know how to talk about it, and we've basically gotten rid of a lot of the terms. Now, most of us will understand that in some ways, God is to religion as Uncle Sam is to nationalism. All right? That's sort of Jordan Peterson's, a low-resolution take on Jordan Peterson's God Number One. Okay? Spiritual is blocked from the conversation because of the fear of Jesus smuggling. And again, I'm hampered by these videos when Eric takes a little while to have it go from podcast to YouTube. Now, I appreciate the fact that not everybody works as efficiently as I do and as with such poor quality controls, but I can't really search the podcast or the transcript of the podcast as easily. But the point that Eric makes in that podcast with Douthat on Jesus smuggling, I thought was super helpful in terms of understanding what Charles Taylor sees as secularity number 3. That this bulwark was put up to keep basically and Douthat talks about it there, basically the wackos who are worried about entrails or Lyme disease or gluten or aliens or all of this. And again, I thought Douthat said it quite well, and it was only a encounter with Lyme's disease that began to teach Douthat, oh wow, science isn't everything. And Eric rightly names out the totalitarian side of public health and science here. And so then there's this middle realm that we have to live in. And I think it's exactly that middle realm that Jordan Peterson sort of opens up with the IDW, and that some of the other members of the IDW are still a little shy of entering. But Eric, I think, is entering more. Like I said, in some ways, he's the love child between Megamind and Alex Jones. Because Eric is a little, just like Jordan would dare go to Liberty University, Eric dares talk about his disc and the Epstein business, and continues to point out, why aren't we talking about these things? And Eric increasingly is talking about these things. Now, this scary space where there might be woo is where you're going to have to go. And it was very interesting this morning in the Discord conversation. We started out with a question about speaking in tongues. And I thought, wow, this would scare the heck out of the Portal Discord. But this is exactly where the strength of religious systems lie, because we're used to dealing with woo. We deal with it all the time. As a pastor, one dear, lovely woman who comes to my church one day tells me about how she's giving money to televangelists, and they're sending her these prayer cloths that have been prayed over, and she keeps them under her clothes on her skin to help her heal. And what do? I'm not going to talk to this lady anymore. What do? Correct her about her ideas of the quack televangelist prayer cloths and whether they're efficacious. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be humble, and I'm going to listen. And part of me says, hey, the prayer cloths are helping. Keep at it, honey. I won't call her honey because that would be sexist, but pastors deal in woo all the time. And pastors live in this liminal space between secularity and religious all the time. And some churches try to divorce it of it, but for me, the Christian Reformed Church tries to live in this space. You can find the confessional faction, the woke faction of the CRC. You can find the dunamis faction, where they're just praying that the Christian Reformed Church will speak in tongues. It's this middle space that Eric is sort of getting into a little bit, and Ross Douthat had to get into because of his Lyme disease, and how many people had to get into it because they had Epstein-Barr or chronic fatigue or gluten insensitivity, or Jordan Peterson and his daughter Michaela got into it because of her illness, and medicine didn't have the answer. And so they risked woo to find the truth. Now, I was super stoked to see J.D. Vance on the Portal, and I thought, hey, now we're getting somewhere. I'm thinking Chris Sarnade, he's probably going to be on this Portal too sometime. But I haven't listened to the whole podcast yet. Just like you, I only have 24 hours in a day, and I wanted to do a video today to be released on Friday. But right away, I could tell this was going to be a good episode. Now, again, I think Eric's skittishness to deal with religion because of an allergy to Jesus smuggling, maybe it's unfair. Eric can correct me. Be happy to talk to him. Or at least not to engage it in public, because that's another part of the modernist agreement, that when we're in public, we don't do the woo. And people who do the woo, well, you get tagged for doing the woo in public, and you'll get labeled for that. You'll lose status for that. So he's talking to J.D. Vance and talking about the source of the book. Now, well, I'll just play it and then I'll comment as we go.
Thank you. So a couple of odd features. You're coming from Southern Ohio with family in Kentucky.
Sure.
And of course, Southern Ohio has more to do with Kentucky than it does to do with, let's say, Cleveland or something like that. So It's culturally closer to Appalachian. Now, it happens, and you may not know this, that I was a folklore minor in college.
That's interesting.
And hillbilly culture and black culture are sort of the two great well springs of American folklore. And so
that's true. Again, and it's a great point.
I was always of the opinion that this was like one of the great artistic regions of our country. And one of the things that meant is that we were left with a lot of folk song, which describes a world that I feel has been almost forgotten.
It has low status.
By coastal America in particular, and this is quite funny, left of center coastal America.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, Eric, of course, is from the left, and so he's seeing through a lens of leftist ideology. And this keeps coming through because he keeps asking the question, how did the Democrats lose Appalachia and, maybe 10% of the African American community, not them yet? How did the Democrats lose them? Religion. I mean, you can't be more obvious, and the evidence of it are the celebrity atheists.
One of the things that I'm dying to talk about is coal and its legacy as we sort of distance ourselves from this sort of dirty form of energy that we because we're so awake and climate aware, we sort of are embarrassed because of the environmental degradation. But this was really the wellspring of both culture and, in some sense, the soul of the American left. And
now via labor, I'm proud to be a coal miner's daughter. That's now a song of the right, not the left. But again, in Eric is on the side that says the Dems should be about the little guy. But the definition of who the little guy is, that's what changed in the social justice wars.
And something absolutely bizarre has happened. And I wondered if we could, because the book has been out for some time, so we're not going to get really fresh questions about the book.
Sure.
But I thought what we might do is sort of examine the legacy of Appalachia with respect to politics, where the country is going, and what you were trying to do with the book when you wrote it. So can you say what it was that you were intending to do when you wrote Hillbilly Elegy?
Yeah, so what I was intending to do, I think, is write a reflection on this idea of the American dream. And
okay, the American dream. Now, if in a monotheistic world we can't modulate our layers with different gods, as let's say happened in the Roman Empire, you would go to the Temple of Augustus to pay your homage to the empire. You would go to the temple of the god of your city to pay homage to Apollo, let's say. You would give homage at the shrine of a healing god or a mystery religion if you needed something like that. Polytheism afforded different levels. Nationalism is, again, sort of a religion, and most Christian churches in America have come to some understanding of it. Some churches will have the American flag and the Christian flag in their sanctuary. When it comes to 4th of July, some Christian churches will sing patriotic songs. There has obviously, and this has got especially heated in the Cold War, been an amalgam of Christianity and nationalism. And so that's there. And that is a part of this story too. And it's a big part of what's happening now in the culture war.
it's something that we become so jaded that it almost feels sort of trite or cheesy to even.
Yeah, that's JD because you went to Yale and have been hanging out with coastal elites because he knows better than I do it's not jaded in other zip codes.
Talk about it, but when I was like a kid growing up in the late 80s, the early 90s, I really had this sense that America was a place where you could be anything, where you could do anything. And of course, over the course of my life, I sort of realized that
Now, where you could be anything and do anything, that's deep in Eric's vision of we need institutions that allow outliers in to bring fresh nonconformity and ideas. This is very much in alignment with the decadence conversation.
Notion is a little bit more complicated than I had expected that it would be. I realized it was a little bit more challenging. I realized when I got to Yale Law School, which was sort of the culmination of my sort of educational and work career up to that point, that the American dream was in a very real sense in crisis, and yet I still sort of held on to it. And it was still sort of a really important part of my.
Now, when we say the American dream is in crisis, what do we mean? That's fundamentally, I would assert, much more of a religious question than an economic one. And I think that's what lays at the heart of Douthit, Thiel, and Weinstein and the source of their discontent.
Identity. And I wanted people to sort of understand that, to understand how you could simultaneously accept that America was imperfect but still love it, that you could still believe that this was the land of opportunity, even though you recognize that most people around you weren't necessarily able to achieve the full measure of that opportunity. And that kind of tension, that really complicated relationship that I had with the American dream was sort of the message that I wanted to deliver. And, my ultimate hope is that somebody would pick up Hillbilly Elegy, would kind of understand the people that I came from, the people that I grew up around, why they thought the way that they did, why they, sort of thought about their country the way that they did, and ultimately why those people are struggling in very real ways, from, the opioid epidemic to a host of other sort of sociological and economic factors. And that's why I wrote it. I don't think I had any sort of super groundbreaking insights in the book. The one truly original thought that I thought that I had was that there were really high rates of religious identification in the part of the country that I came from, but religious participation had sort of fallen off a cliff. So you had this weird
bingo
juxtaposition of people who were devoutly religious but not connected to a real church.
Isn't it interesting that happened before an analogous and perhaps parallel dislocation of individuals and institutions that we see in the political realm? If religion is the always and politics is the now, the kind of parallelisms between them shouldn't be surprising. I want to read a little bit of Hillbilly Elegy here. There's a lot of screaming, some punching and driving, and then a stopped car on the side of the road full of two sobbing kids. Mama, that's Vance's grandmother who raised him because his mother had some serious issues, intervened before things got out of hand. But it's a miracle we didn't crash and die. Mom driving and slapping the kids in the back seat, Mama on the passenger side slapping and screaming at Mom. That's why the car stopped. Though Mom was a multitasker, this was too much. We drove home in silence after Mama explained that if Mom lost her temper again, Mama would shoot her in the face. That night we stayed at Mama's house. I'll never forget Lindsay's face as she marched upstairs to bed. It wore the pain of defeat known only by a person who experiences the highest high and the lowest low in a matter of minutes. She had been on the cusp of achieving a childhood dream. Now she was just another teenage girl with a broken heart. In the sermon I just finished, we live most of our lives somewhere between average and atrocity. Preachers just can't give up alliteration. Mama turned to retire to her couch, where she would watch Law and Order, read the Bible, and fall asleep. I stood on the narrow walkway that separated the living room from the dining room and asked Mama a question that had been on my mind since she ordered Mom to drive us home safely. I knew what she'd say, but I guess I just wanted reassurance. Mama, Does God love us? What do you think he meant by God there? As a child. Probably meant the default low resolution meaning, which draws its roots way, way back to the alternative to the meta-divine realm and the God of Israel. She hung her head, gave me a hug, and began to cry. The question wounded Mama, because the Christian faith stood at the center of our lives, especially hers. We never went to church except on rare occasions in Kentucky when Mom decided that what we needed in our lives was religion. Nevertheless, Mama's was a deeply personal, albeit quirky, faith. She was not afraid of the woo. She couldn't say organized religion without contempt. She saw churches as breeding grounds for perverts and money changers. There's a lot of truth to that. In some of the most, well, I'm stopping reading here. In some of the places where folk religion is its thickest, they're served by the worst kind of churches, in my opinion. But there are reasons for this. In the same way that Douthit draws association between trying to find out about his Lyme disease and the doctors you find on the internet who don't have degrees or certificates. Back to the book. And she hated what she called the loud and proud, people who wore their faith on their sleeve, always ready to let you know how pious they were. Still, she sent much of her spare income to churches in Jackson, Kentucky, especially those controlled by Reverend Don Eisen, an older man who bore a striking resemblance to the priest of The Exorcist. Mama might have been one of the kind of people that would wear prayer cloths under her clothes. By Mama's reckoning, God never left our side. He celebrated with us when times were good and comforted us when they weren't. During one of our many trips to Kentucky, Mama was trying to merge onto the highway after a brief stop for gas. She didn't pay attention to the signs, so we found ourselves heading the wrong way on the one-way exit ramp with angry motorists swerving out of our way. I was screaming in terror, but after the U-turn on a 3-lane interstate, the only thing Mama said about the incident was, "We're fine, goddammit. Don't you know Jesus rides in the car with me?" And again, if you go to a church, this is who you'll be with. Read C.S. Lewis about enduring church services in England, and it's in the Screwtape Letters. The theology she taught was unsophisticated, but it provided a message I needed to hear. To coast through life was to squander my God-given talent, so I had to work hard. I had to take care of my family because Christian duty demanded it. I needed to forgive, not just for my mother's sake, but for my own. I should never despair, for God had a plan. Mama often told a parable. A young man was sitting at home when a terrible rainstorm began. Within hours, the man's house began to flood, and someone came to his door offering a ride to higher ground. The man declined, saying, "God will take care of me." A few hours later, as the waters engulfed the first floor of the man's home, a boat passed by, and the captain offered to take the man to safety. The man declined, saying, "God would take care of me." A few hours after that, as the man waited on the roof, the entire home flooded. A helicopter flew by, and the pilot offered transportation to dry ground. Again, the pilot declined, telling the pilot that God would take care of him. Soon, therefore, the waters overcame the man, and he stood before God in heaven. He protested his fate. "You promised that you'd help me so long as I was faithful." God replied, "I sent you a car, a boat, and a helicopter. Your death is your own fault. God helps those who help themselves," which is not in the Bible. This is the wisdom of the book of Mama. Now, read that paragraph and watch Bishop Barron's comment on Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo and the guy who drowns have something in common. And it's the movement towards God number 2. Now, you wouldn't think this guy who's God's going to rescue me, so it can't be a car or a boat or a helicopter, and Governor Cuomo that says we solved it ourselves, would have much in common, but they do. So listen carefully to what Bishop Barron said, and think carefully about Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris talking past each other. I think Jordan knows what Sam is talking about, but Sam doesn't know what Jordan is talking about. Sam would be right there with Governor Cuomo. Now, I've talked about this book a few times, but I think it weighs in an important way in the conversation. I've mentioned George Marsden a few times. George Marsden is an Ivy League intellectual. He was also one of my history teachers at Calvin College back in the day. But he is probably one of the best historians, he's getting up there in age now, of these questions of religion and secularity in American culture. And one of his more recent books, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, deals with a lot of this. In the late spring of 1960, Life, America's immensely popular pictorial news magazine, claiming a readership of 25 million, published a crucial U.S. debate. They were trying to make sense out of World War II as well. And I think as Douthit made the comment in Eric's podcast, World War I, basically, he didn't make this whole comment, I'm adding to it. World War I basically sobered up the world to say, no, we are not in charge. World War II said, the ascendant secularity that you think will give you a handle on the world will not lead where you think it will. And so after World War II, and this is what the point Douthit made, kind of put us in a liminal space that is we can't give up the ethics of Christianity, we can't give up the humanism, because then we'll look like Adolf. And so that's the crisis in the 50s that they're dealing with. The crisis of the 40s, and now the crisis of the Cold War and recruiting God to fight like Thor against the Soviet Union, or like Captain America, who incidentally is the only one who seems to be able to wield Thor's hammer. So in the late spring of 1960, Life, America's immensely popular pictorial news magazine, claimed a readership of 25 million, published crucial U.S. debate in the 5-part series, The National Purpose, Meaning. The authors, a distinguished group, included not only professional observers of the national scene, headed by the legendary Walter Lippmann, but also men of practical affairs, such as David Sarnoff, the head of the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and some of you are young enough to not recognize RCA. Others, such as poet Archibald MacLeish, received recent 2-time Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson and evangelist Billy Graham were among the most famous representatives of major areas of American life. Notice how church was included in that in 1960 like it would not be included today. And notice who was included. Maybe Rick Warren for Obama's presidential inauguration comes close. But notice the skirmish in the 2012 inauguration over Giglio and his stance on same-sex marriage. It was unremarkable at the time that all the contributors were white males. It was just as unremarkable that the forum included clergymen, even though the clergyman was an ardent evangelical, as well as being the only Southerner in the mix. This from another page. The Life magazine symposium on the national purpose exemplifies a well-remembered feature of the 1950s, the effort to build a national consensus in the face of communist threats. Adlai Stevenson and Billy Graham could bat in the same lineup. That's a great line. Congratulations, George. That's a great line. Adlai Stevenson and Billy Graham could bat in the same lineup. Now, imagine, if you will, such a thing today. Number one, you can't, because we don't have monolith like Time Life, who could have the attention of the nation for a conversation for the national purpose. Now it's done in 1,000 podcasts and many YouTube videos and blog entries and journal articles, and the principality is fractured. And Billy Graham, anybody that would have someone like Billy Graham would not bat in the same lineup as Adlai Stevenson. They, among with business leaders, journalists, scientists, and other scholars, could join in a single national conversation. Now, with lately Trump, again, trying to bring business leaders in front of the camera on the White House in the COVID epidemic, in some ways, Trump is trying to do what happened in the 50s. And I think in some ways, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Dennis Prager, Donald Trump, this is a decadent coming back of the 50s with us. And in some ways, even the progress conversation wants us to hopefully maybe backtrack to the space program to figure out where we can pick up the thread again because we've lost it. That's a George MacDonald citation. Now, I'm going to take a drink first. Now, I want to bring in Andrew Root's book because what he's basically going to do is apply the 800 pages of Charles Taylor to the question of clergy. Okay? And why the question of clergy? Because it pertains to me? Fair enough. But because in some ways, the change in the place of clergy is a signal to the far broader developments. And I think Andrew lays this narrative out well in this chapter of the book. Now, I should say, I disagree with a fair amount of what's in Andrew's book here. And that shows my journey with the IDW. IDW folks will read this book and it's going to sound very mainish. It's going to sound too woke for their liking. But Andrew, I think, is offering some real insight into this narrative, and he lays it out well. This is from Andrew Root's The Pastor in a Secular Age. A historical map of the pastor in a secular age. I'm not sure what I'm doing, he said. I've never met him before, but I've talked with hundreds of him and hers after speaking at pastors' conferences. The air of fragile coincidence was familiar. This sense of being lost in the house you grew up in. I've been a pastor for 15 years, and most days I have no idea what I'm doing. Some of you pastors, it shows. Now, this is part of the reason why this book is going to seem a little wokish. Now, in the secular frame, some of you are a little too allergic to the woo than is good for you, because you need to dare to wade into woo spaces and not get reactive. Well, same goes for wokish IDW people. You need to dare to wade into woke places and not get too reactive. Now, I would assert that the meaning crisis is in some ways paying a heavier toll on pastors in the mainline-ish segment of the church, more than especially pastors in the Pentecostal section of the church, because the point of Pentecostalism was to re-enchant the world through blunt force narrative. And that's what Pentecostal churches do. They don't care what the coastal elites think about anything. They're just pushing their narrative through. That's in a sense, and again, read T.M. Luhrmann's When God Talks Back, an Ivy League anthropologist who decides to spend some time in a Vineyard church. Now, Vineyard isn't deep Pentecostalism. Vineyard is Presbyterian Pentecostal. So, Jonathan Wimber taught at Fuller Seminary, and Andrew Root got his divinity degree from Fuller Seminary. So Fuller Seminary, like the Christian Reformed Church, is one of these more moderate spaces where you're going to have less allergy to either the woo or the wokish. I could only pause and allow the silence to invite him to say more. Nice pastoral move. I mean, I know what I'm doing. Well, maybe all too well. I have no trouble filling my days and doing things that make me a good pastor. I actually think I am a good, even a faithful pastor. There was the confidence when it came to being a pastoral professional. Competence. He had it. There had been 15 years of success. Of course he had stories of failure and mistakes, but now success, if you go back to John Sook's conversation with me, his church has $1 million budget. That's success. A successful pastor, whether mainline or Pentecostal, is someone who has numbers, whether butts in the seat or bucks in the plate. That's how success is judged. And again, go back to a previous video where I read from Edward Dox's definition of postmodernity. In postmodernity, when everything is up for grabs, well, what we can really agree on is votes and dollars. Or, same thing in church. Of course he had stories of failure and mistakes, but like all good professionals, he had learned from them. So in a sense, he had a very good idea of what he was doing and was successful at. But then the confidence cracked. Yet I have this sick feeling, this kind of dull unease in my stomach. It's the meaning crisis. That something is wrong. I'm not sure of its origins or why it's there, but it's just this discomfort, like I'm missing something. Like something is slipping through your fingers, I said. Yes, he returned, but in a way that gives me a nauseous feeling. Now, Jordan Peterson is a pastor, passed away a few years ago. Those of you who are not afraid of Christian books, read his book, The Pastor. In many ways, he was dealing with this, but not with any of this IDW language. Canada is known for snowy hockey pucks and Tim Hortons coffee. Back to Canada again. I'm always dealing with Canada. Not surprisingly, the Great White North is less well known for hosting the Massey lectures on politics, culture, and philosophy. Yet these lectures are famous not only for being aired on the CBC, but also boasting past presenters like Noam Chomsky and Martin Luther King Jr. In 1991, Charles Taylor, the Montreal philosopher, who we met in the first volume of this series, delivered the lectures, The Malaise of Modernity. Taylor articulated something in these lectures that we could continue to explore years later in his book, The Secular Age, in which he investigated the way in which our late modern world strikes us with a general feeling of discomfort, a kind of unease. Taylor describes this as malaise, a nagging illness, the source which can't be identified. Now, Eric Weinstein, he's feeling the malaise, baby. He explains that this low-grade cultural stomachache may have its origin in at least three things. The sense of fragility of meaning. Can't say fragile, not think of Nassim Taleb. A felt flatness of our attempts to solemnize the crucial moments of the passages of our lives. I think about that. I think about a moment when I saw two people, probably deeper in folk religion than formal religion, hugging in a hospital waiting room in a critical moment, singing, "You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them." And I thought, both these two people were raised in church, and it wasn't a hymn that came to mind out of the Psalter hymnal. It was a Kenny Rogers song. That says something not good about my tradition. An utter emptiness of the ordinary. Bingo, meaning crisis. No wonder that the pastor I met above felt a dull sense of unease, a vocational nausea, like he didn't know what he was doing. If the cultural malaise had indeed arrived, there's no surprise that the pastor would feel this like patient zero. Now we know what that means. In a secular age, Taylor calls this unease the malaise of the immanence. It is as though living in a world free of transcendence, enchantment, and an organization. Let me make sure I didn't go 2 pages. Enchantment and an organization around divine action has given us a freedom that leaves us with discomfort we can't pinpoint, a dull boredom we can't shake. As I discussed in Volume 1, we had arrived at a secular age not because people no longer see as necessary to go to church and are willing to mark none on a survey, but rather because the very idea that there could be a personal God who orders and acts in the cosmos has become unbelievable, or at least contested. Now, to the best of my root, Andrew, just like Pepsi Cola, is not watching the Freddie and Paul show. Andrew Root is not observing the Paul Vanderklay channel in his hours and hours of rambling videos. Status is probably too high. Or we could say that we now live in a world where it is quite easy to forget, deny, or simply not care that there is a transcendent dimension to reality. Taylor's point is that the price paid for this freedom is an uneasy boredom, an ailment of felt flatness. Now, what it could be, that what Eric Weinstein is signaling, is that there might be a higher price still that is to come. That in fact, when we lose the religion, we lose the principality. And without the principality, we're really not too sure Uncle Sam exists. If ministry were only about getting people to join the institutional church, then a pastor could hone her professional skills. His wife is a pastor, and like I said, this is a little mainline-ish, so he's going to say her for pastor to try to acquire some sort of balance, gender balance about pastoring. So go ahead and note that in the comment section. I'm just going to read it as is unless I mess up. If ministry were only to get people to join an institutional church, then the pastor could hone her professional skills and battle for the market share. And many denominations and seminaries have settled for this understanding as understanding of a pastor, both evangelical and mainline, frankly. But what caused the pastor I was talking with to have a stomach ache and overall feeling of malaise was the unexpressed realization that the very God he preached had become unnecessary. And in turn, this led him to feel something deep enough beyond words that in this shrouded void, he was not needed at all. This is haunted by Eugene Peterson's books. He was standing in the line of an old vocational tradition, of course, but he nevertheless felt like he was on new ground. Pastors like Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Becket, Jonathan Edwards never dealt with the fragility of meaning, the flatness of our moments of passage, the emptiness of the ordinary. It could be as hard for them to understand the feeling of malaise as it would a smartphone. They ministered in a world where haunting meaning spitted out of every corner in omens and revelations. And not only were baptisms, weddings, and festivals embedded in the thick cosmic drama of worship and absolution, so much so that Becket had to remind King Henry that he too must obey, but the passage from life to death was short and sudden. This was anything but flat, and the ordinary was filled to overflowing. Go back and look at my conversation with Andrew that I posted today. This is Friday, May 1, about Andrew baptizing his friend. That situation is haunted with this dynamic. This was anything but flat, and the ordinary was filled with overflowing. For Augustine and Becket, anything ordinary existed in a chain of being that played its part in sacral reality. See now, I think right there, that sentence might fall prey to what Bishop Barron pointed out, because what I would argue is that it's not so much God in the chain of being, at the top of the chain of being, which is what Bishop Barron is pointing out with Cuomo's talk. It's sacramentality, that you see God through everything in the chain of being. Okay? That's the transition to sacramentality. For Edwards, ordinariness, particularly of raising children, held such cosmic weight that his primary pastoral task, particularly from the pulpit, was to push his congregants to live upright, ordinary lives in order to raise children well enough to keep them from hell. For Edwards' Calvinist Puritanism, ordinary life was the stage where heaven and hell collided. Not so much for this pastor. He was living in different times. Quite literally, We'll discuss this time transformation more below, but to illustrate, for Augustine, Becket, and in his own way Edwards, time wasn't frozen in a linear progression as we now assume. Certain moments cast meaning over all of ordinary life by shifting time. And again, I think I would alter Root's book by a heavier emphasis on sacramentality and how sacramentality impacts time. The people to whom Augustine, Becket, and Edwards ministered had a shared imagination, a social imaginary, as Taylor calls it, that led them to assume that Good Friday in the year 435, 1138, and 1753 was closer to the ordinary day of the crucifixion than a midsummer evening in 433, 1130, or 1750. Or to say it more directly, they would say that a holy day, say Good Friday 2018, is closer to the crucifixion than an ordinary day, say July 10, 2015. The meaning of the crucifixion was so heavy that it bends time. And again, Root isn't really escaping linearity here, and I think that's my dominant critique of his book here. Giving us passage into living and participating in the crucifixion's cosmic significance and transforming our empty ordinary days into a haunting sacred reality. It was the pastor's job to stand on the boundary of these times, helping people make sense of the flood of meaning as the pastor moved people back and forth between ordinary and sacred times. The ordinary was preparation for the coming extraordinary passage into sacred times. And again, if you watch Jonathan Pageau, this is what Jonathan Pageau is doing with his channel. There was no need to find meaning because all of reality was pocked with time-traveling wormholes, and it was the pastor's job, particularly in Becket's time, to drive people in and out of these time-bending events. But this time jumping was wearying. Just as the astronaut prepares for a zero gravity, it also assumes that no one could jump time without training. The level of constant preparation for the ordinary time for the passages into extraordinary time was a burden, and it seems to just keep ramping up the number of prayers, the need to touch relics, the fasting, and so much more. Nevertheless, it was the pastor's job to, in love, keep prodding and pushing the people to prepare, because one time jump or another was around the corner. Celebration of the Eucharist, Good Friday, Pentecost, and some wormhole was soon to be on the horizon. Now, his wormholes is really what he's getting at as sacraments, because sacraments are, in effect, the wormholes. And if we weren't ready, the meaninglessness was so heavy that it would rip our souls into pieces. And we were all in this together. So if you decided not to pray or even to secretly dabble in witchcraft, we all could be obliterated when we hit the zero gravity of sacred time. Good Friday was as frightening as it was celebratory. Look at Annie Dillard's comment about wearing crash helmets in church. It's one of the most frequently quotes that I've posted on my blog. The pastor had to live under this constant burden while avoiding the temptations to which many succumbed. The pastor had to balance the utter power of driving the vessel, called the church, that not only organized, almost in full, people's lives, but also moved people in and out of these wormholes of salvation. The world of the pastor I was talking with at the conference couldn't be more different. But this radical difference didn't come through a coup d'etat. It was not a direct and immediate overthrow that led the open wormholes one day to suddenly be paved over the next. Rather, getting us to this secular age in which time is frozen in linear progression and ordinary life is freed from the pressure of cosmic significance, has taken many years and many more small changes that have mostly but surely shrunk the once gaping wormholes that have, in other words, destroyed the sacraments. It is not that meaning, rites of passage, and the significance of the ordinary have been annihilated. It is just that they have been hollowed out, repurposed for ends other than experiencing the divine. Now again, experiencing the divine, it's a little Schleiermachish. It's not sacramental enough for me. And that's my complaint about this book. But Root nicely runs through this narrative. This is why it feels like a malaise. Surely, slowly but surely, in the West, the transcendent dimension to life became optional, in no small part because people, particularly a growing elite, became sick of pastoral prodding, and the institution lost its tyranny. They wanted their ordinary lives to be less haunted, less directly connected to divine consequence. Maybe 1 and 2 speed things. Anyway. But this wanting to be free from the sacred monopoly, so you see, in many ways, Root is sort of stalking the subtraction story by Caputo, and he's too close to it for my sense of comfort. But this wanted to be free from the sacred monopoly that the pastor or the priest possessed had its origin not in doubt but in belief, not in apathy but in the passion to follow God. Seeking to be even more faithful to God, soon people wrestled with the keys of the vehicle of salvation from the hands of corrupt priests who were reformed to no longer drive buses of salvation but teach individuals to drive themselves. The Protestant Reformation made each person responsible for his or her own being before a holy God. All were taught to read the Bible for themselves, given the keys to drive their own faith, and where they would maneuver was no longer into the haunting wormholes where time was bent, but around the common neighborhoods of their ordinary lives. Now, again, I think where Root missteps here is, no, they saw themselves as they didn't have to wait for the priest to conjure the wormhole. They could do it themselves. Communion on the beach. Baptism with a friend. With pietistic desire to give everyone direct access to the vehicle of salvation, the bold line between the sacred and the secular became thinner. This was not because everything was now secular, as we today assume it to be, but because everything was sacred. Even diaper changing and cow milking, as Luther would say, were transformed into tasks done before God. Remember, 1 speed, not 2 speed. Previously, the ordinary duties were done outside the sacred and, at best, could be seen as only preparation for the common horizon of the wormhole. But after the Reformation, these common tasks were not just preparatory, but the actual location of divine encounter. The Reformation was a reform of our daily practices as much as our theology. Everything now held cosmic consequence. The pastor's job was no longer to stand on the precipice between sacred and secular time, moving in and out of the sacred. Now the pastor was about to mount the pulpit steps and preach the word, capital W, directing the hearers to repent and remember that all time and therefore all tasks are sacred. Now we have the minister of the word. That's my title in the Christian Reformed Church. Because the event of salvation was released from its isolation in sacred time, all time, be it spent nursing babies or plowing fields, bore the responsibility of the sacred. All believers were now priests because all parts of life witnessed to salvation. This is the sacramentality of all, in a sense. These ordinary tasks now held even the more cosmic significance, though stripped down like some 1980s punk band. All the magic and much of the pomp that reminded people of the difference between sacred and secular time was done away with. For example, shifting from a fresco-filled church in Italy to a Puritan congregational prayer house in New England. One is built to remind you that you have left the profane and moved into sacred space. The other is empty and plain to remind you that God comes into the ordinary, like this simple white room, making all space sacred. Hence the difference between the cathedral and the low church plain building. After the Reformation, meaning, rites of passage, and the ordinary were no longer organized around a bold sacred or secular divide as they were for Augustine and Becket. Now everything was sacred. For Edwards, meaning was everywhere, and the weight of salvation carried out in the ordinary actions of work, marriage, and child rearing. In Edwards' Puritan Calvinism, every minute and every task were to reshape the creation realm, releasing it from the hold of evil to reflect the holy. Go back and look at my conversation about New Haven, Connecticut, and look at the plans drawn up and how they reflect the city four square found in the book of Revelation. The pastor needed to be as involved in civic matters as in ecclesial ones because all of ordinary life had divine consequences, and it was through a polite, disciplined society that life would reflect the divine. If there was a line between forces, it was no longer dividing sacred from secular time, but now dividing order from disorder. Sound familiar, Jordan Peterson fans? God from the devil. The devil sought to push ordinary life towards chaos. It was our corporate vocation to double down on the ordinary, taking disciplined actions to free it from the devil's control. In some respect, Eric Weinstein, in the mode he's been at on Twitter and Pentecost and his Periscope and his podcast, have been very much the preacher mode, not unlike Jordan. It was every Christian's job to create a dependable world out of our ordinary lives that reflected heaven and freed people from hell. Witches needed to be burned not because people had gone totally mad, although maybe a little, but because the devil was always at work, and most directly in our shared ordinary lives, in the behavior of our children. If evil was allowed to foothold into our civic space, the whole society would become demonic and our salvation would be lost. Now that's salvation again in continuity, all right? Not a hugely defined two worlds. The Puritans were not a group that would pen a song that said, "This world is not my home." That would come much later, much more development of secularity. Because all ordinary life was sacred, there could be no risk of giving the devil a foothold, particularly in our homes, schools, or meeting houses. We needed to keep the devil in the forest, out of our shared social space of order, and keep him in a literal but also metaphorical space of chaos, dark magic, and frightening mystery. Now, Root needs to listen to some Peugeot here, because that could help clean up some of this. We needed to keep the... Puritan Calvinism created dependable structures to order our ordinary lives so that the world became a place where human beings could flourish. Now, remember, Puritan Calvinism is one of the two parents of America. The other were tobacco growers, which was sort of a drug industry in the southern states. For pastors in the 19th and early 20th century like Henry Ward Beecher and Harry Emerson Fosdick, a huge piece of pastoral identity was to work for human flourishing by being deeply involved in civic matters. Now you might recognize the development of the main line, okay? Beecher used his pulpit to fight against slavery, becoming close friends with Abraham Lincoln. Fosdick spoke against war and addiction, becoming a staple in early 20th century New York cultural life with John D. Rockefeller Jr. always by his side, with the money. Like Edwards, both Beecher and Fosdick saw the pastor as fighting for human flourishing. But unlike Edwards, both Beecher and Fosdick took direct steps to shake off the rigid Puritan Calvinism that feared devils and hell around every ordinary corner. Both followed Edwards in contending that in these ordinary spaces we worked out our salvation, but unlike Edwards, they no longer thought the devil was in the forest. The titans of industry who built churches like Beecher's Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn and Fosdick's Riverside Church in Manhattan's Morningside Heights had helped disenchant the forest, running iron rails through it and piercing its crust for oil. Pastors in Beecher's and Fosdick's time, however, were insulated from a malaise and loss of pastoral identity because they were the producers of and also protectors of human flourishing. Things had changed from Edward's time, when clergy were by far the most educated men in the colonies, who not only could read and govern, but also provide the knowledge of salvation. In Edward's day, the pastor had a monopoly on importance. This was no longer the case for Beecher and Fosdick. The world that those like Edwards had helped build allowed for education to move far beyond church matters, and a dependable world allowed for the institution building and economic stability that could produce a Rockefeller. Now, I would modulate some of that, but pretty good. But while the world had changed, pastors like Beecher and Fosdick were still essential. Now we're moving in the 20th century all the way up to the heyday of the main line during the Cold War. As in the 19th century unfolded, things gradually flipped. Where the Reformation had said that there was no divide between the sacred and the secular because everything, particular ordinary lives, were sacred, things shifted, like a negative in an old photo, to the opposite. People began to assume that because there was no divide between sacred and secular, and ordinary life was important, maybe everything was just secular. After all, the devil had been cast out of the forest, and the world disenchanted through technology, science, and medicine. And this, by the way, is why in New Agers, they never worry about finding the devil in the spiritual world. Not only has the secular world been purged of devils, so has the spiritual that they are remaking in the New Age movement. After all, as industrialization took hold, we needed pastors to check our secular excesses and to encourage us to live upright lives, particularly now that most of us were living in new urban centers where temptations were ripe. And again, this is what I talk about, that after Darwin, well, we use science to discover what is, and we use the Bible to discover what ought to be. Now, the Bible is going to, obviously, after the Cold War and through the 60s, also come under suspicion. We needed pastoral exhortation not to keep us from hell, as Edwards would believe, but to allow us to flourish as an end in itself. Now, right here, already you probably have noted the parting of the main line and the evangelical, because the evangelical continue to carry the older tradition, although continuing to be changed and transformed too, because these movements, as Taylor points out, transform us when we're not paying attention. For Edwards, flourishing was a sign that we were in a society bent towards salvation, reflecting heaven. In Fosdick's time, her human flourishing could become its own end, cut loose from any sacred purpose. Yet we needed pastors to remind us to avoid that which would turn us personally from flourishing, things like drinking and gambling that attack the affirmation of ordinary life, and to call titans of industry to remember their responsibility to keep the world in a dependable place where machines helped humans flourish and not flounder. And you can see there where, in many ways, the new postmodern woke Christianity is the heir of the mainline, and why you see that continuing to flourish in the mainline, and why you see the very strange new reversal that Peter Boghossian has been pointing out, where now suddenly celebrity atheists are talking to conservative pastors. Why would that be? It's because of these major movements. The pastor felt no malaise because he was the chaplain of the dawning secular age, adding religious moralisms to the system that had turned our ordinary lives into something fully secular. In a world that had become fully secular, the pastor became the manifestation of our conscience, our better gods, or our better angels, let's say, holding an important and meaningful place. Yet although the pastor held this seemingly important place, now, this is where it gets really tricky, because in the black community, these dynamics were a little bit different. So Martin Luther King Jr., as sort of a neo-Orthodox pastor, was very much in the heart of the main line. And when you look at what's his name? He's on CNN, the black pastor, the Tawana Brawley case. Why can't I think of him right now? But he's on CNN, very much functioning in the mainline role. Yet, though the pastor held this seemingly important place, he was no longer the linchpin of our cultural life. Now that ordinary life was no longer sacred, but only secular, it wouldn't be long until the chaplain position was extraneous. And we see the movement of that with Billy Graham. He's part there of the Life magazine, Our National Purpose conversation, but it isn't run by pastors. Recently, Hail Caesar, what's the name of the brothers? I can never think of these things off the top of my head. A Coen Brothers film. Notice the conversation between the director, the rabbi, the priest, and the mainline pastor. All over it. As the 20th century dawned, the world the pastor inhabited could be imagined for only and exclusively human flourishing. Period. We could get human flourishing without needing God. This is essentially the argument you'll hear Sam Harris and Nat Dillahunty make again and again and again and again and again and again and again. Well, maybe we learned some good things by Christianity, but we can do this much better without it, using rationality. And now again, I would assert that assertion does not stand up to the kind of work that John Vervaeke is doing in cognitive science. As the 20th century dawned, the world the pastor inherited could be imagined for only and exclusively human flourishing, period. We could get human flourishing without needing God at all, a thought that would make Edwards turn over in his grave. He lived in a different world. It seemed ever possible that we could get to human flourishing and continue to create a dependable world, competence, without any real longing for sacred time or needed to be protected from the devil. It was assumed that we no longer even needed pastoral chaplains to keep us on the right track. Soon enough, some pastors at least intuitively agreed, turning to the new sciences such as psychology to do their pastoral work and to the new methods of text criticism to read their Bibles. It's a transition in the 20th century. A lot of pastors became free shrinks. After all, the pastor's job was not to take people into sacred time or uphold the sacredness of ordinary life, but to help people flourishing. And it appeared that the new secular disciplines of psychology and sociology were much more helpful in this vein, because of course their goal was give them a sense of flourishing. And again, this is Sam Harris's plan right here. I just know what flourishing is. Good is flourishing, bad is less flourishing. But the frame is me. Hence, the rush of politics in this frame, because religion is always and politics is now. So if this is helping me flourish now, okay. But what about Homer? That's something for future Homer to worry about. Flourishing now and tomorrow, these things give us trouble. Now that ordinary life was just secular, hyper-pragmatism entered pastoral practice. Who needed those theological ideas? Our job was to help people flourish, to be society's conscience, not to move them in an immaterial, counterintuitive reality. This pragmatism was never left to the American pastoral identity because our pastoral imaginary is tightly wound around the social imaginary in the secular age, even in the most conservative evangelicalism, and Root is right there. Now, an immanent frame enclosed our lives. I make the point that Root is right there because that's how you can understand the seeker movement. That's exactly what the seeker movement did. It's exactly why seeker movement churches, when they got large enough, would hire a psychologist on staff to do the therapy for the people. Now, an immanent frame enclosed our lives in entirely natural, as opposed to supernatural, ways of being. Forget that distinction, by the way. The immanent frame was being used to define as completely secular not only our ordinary lives, but also the pastoral task. George Albert Coe, a teacher at Fosdick's Union Seminary, could assert that the goal of Christian education was not the transcendent, sacred reality of the kingdom of God, but the democracy of God, an immanent bound space of human flourishing that had no need for transcendent referent. The Bible was taken apart like one of the engines of Ford's motor cars, and the immanent cultural background and source material of the text was examined, shaking out for its transcendent quality, leaving many questions whether it still possessed the sacred power to drive us to salvation, or whether it was just a book. Sam Harris finds parts of the Bible he can appreciate. If I speak in the tongue of men and of angels, but have not love, I am nothing. Take the love, clip out the men and angels. Well, Sam Harris is just a further development of Thomas Jefferson's Bible. When Pastor Karl Barth, in a working-class village in Switzerland, mounted his pulpit in the steps in 1914 on the eve of World War I, armed with the best German theological education, he became dizzy with despair. This is also an Abram Kuyper story. Overcome with a stomachache not unlike the pastor I met at the conference. He cleared his throat to preach and caught the eyes of tired faces of his congregation. Ordinary people, like people in the Appalachian that needed a word of hope. And what Barth discovered is that his theological conversation has emptied him. Like the pastor I met, he had no idea what he was doing. The Bible had no more meaning. The passages of congregants' lives flattened by industrialization, their ordinary experience, now completely immanent and secular, and Europe itself was about to be shaken to its core by a war. Are we about to be shaken by COVID? Barth had essentially followed the lead of Beecher and Fosdick, seeing himself as the chaplain of the modern world, enclosed in an immanent frame. Human flourishing could be achieved in a fully secular way. It was the pastor's job to support human flourishing by reminding society of its mortal commitments. Barth believed with his professors that the pastor's job was to participate in the progress of human flourishing, which needed no sense of divine action or sacred reality. But when those professors' names appeared on the front page of the newspaper signing the Kaiser's declaration of war, this young pastor realized that being a chaplain to the secular society who willingly gave up the preaching of God's judgment, sin, and salvation could not lead to human flourishing it's promised. World War I shook him. Why? Because read basically the religious history of World War I. He had been duped. Deconstructing his Bible and being the chaplain of a secular society led him not to human flourishing, but to the hellscape of France's trenches. And so Barth had to start all over again, seeking a way to speak of the coming of the transcendent God into the immanent frame of modern life. Barth's strategy was to find within biblical language itself a way to speak of God's breaking into a modern world framed by immanence. Yet back across the pond in America, another tactic was chosen to deal with this new unease: full-on battle. So, in other words, Peterson is sort of a Barth-like character, because Peterson is sign of a transitional character. He's going to do the biblical series from a psychological perspective, but as Destiny, what a name for a dude doing videos on YouTube. As Rationality Rules pointed out, Jordan Peterson put up the staircase without the top floor. And as he reminded me through David Fuller, well, that's the city of God up at the top. And so people following Jordan, it was one quick step to, well, I'm not a scientist. I don't need to be bound by all Jordan's scientific consciences. I'll just jump right into the kingdom. In America, another tactic had chosen to deal with the new unease: full-on battle. Angrily bound in the immanent frame, a group of pastors and professors decided that the only way to deal with the secular age was to destroy it. returning to the fundamentals. Now he's pointing at the fundamentalists, but the Pentecostals did this just on their own. They Benedict opted the whole thing. You know, we're not going to wait around for those academics to give us reasons to believe this or that. We're just going to speak in tongues, baby. Returning to the fundamentals, to the sources, the Bible and the creeds, before the imminent frame challenged them, they set their sights on those pastors who conceded to being chaplains of the secular age and who saw their task as furthering human flourishing. A major issue that conservatives even today have yet to solve is how, in opposing the reductions of the imminent frame, they can avoid the perception of being against justice and mercy and can support all human flourishing. There you have the main frame, the main line versus evangelical, and the progressive element evangelical being the bleeding transitions in the middle. Fosdick's pastoral ministry could be ground zero of this battle. He'd be painted as a modernist and kicked out of the pulpit of his Presbyterian church, taking arrow after arrow from fundamentalists. The battle appeared to come to a head in 1925 when fundamentalists threw all their weight behind the trial of John Thomas Scopes, arguing him that teaching evolution in his Tennessee classroom. The fundamentalists had a secret weapon, William Jennings Bryan, the three-time professional presidential candidate, as prosecutor. No one could argue that Bryan was a backwoods hick, someone disconnected from the organization of our ordinary lives. Bryan showed a need to move back from the secular presumptions of our lives and remind us that it is in educating children that we work out our salvation, taking us back towards Edward's day. I'm not sure that's a fair reading of William Jennings Bryan. There's a lot of other things going through that trial, including a critique of social Darwinism. So, but this, what Andrew Root is telling is sort of the majority subtraction story in a Taylor way. Sure enough, Bryan won the battle, but the fundamentalists lost the war, and of course that would yield to Rachel Held Evans eventually. They miscalculated how little people were willing to return to Edward's time to deal again with pastoral prodding and haunting of divine consequences in each moment of our ordinary lives. The fundamentalists underestimated what an exciting freedom the secular age was. Our ordinary lives were now assumed to be completely on our own. So when Rhett and Link deconstruct, they're there with Sam Harris. Hey, why didn't I do this before? All this worrying about virginity and drinking beer and all that kind of stuff. You know, now at least if I've got my desires moderately contained, I can enjoy a lot more being freed from, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you do. I'm freed from the God who worries if I masturbate. Again, look up Sam and Jordan, Vancouver 1. We were free to do with our lives what we wanted. New forms of leisure in the 1920s and expression in the 1960s were before us. It was too thrilling to pass up, but only if we could find a way to deal with the uneasy feeling that this freedom of living without divine consequence also flattened our experiences. The need to cope with this feeling gave us the more reason to delve headlong into the leisure of the 1920s and the consumer consumption and sex of the 1960s. Between the 1920s and the 1960s, Fosdick remained a significant figure, unscathed by the fundamentalist battles now that the fundamentalists had retreated and become separatist. If they couldn't move the whole culture back to a time when ordinary life bore sacred significance, they could surely do it in small communities, chasing the devil back into the woods and preparing, through the rigid discipline of their ordinary lives, for the coming apocalypse. Now we've got Weinstein as an apocalyptic preacher. When Fosdick was put on the cover of Time in 1930, it showed that indeed the pastor had a significant place in the modern world. The pastor, as the conscience of our secular ordinary lives, was not only important but also esteemed. His contribution to human flourishing was essential. By the time Fosdick retired in 1946, this was unquestioned. The 1950s would further solidify the pastor's necessity. Our secular economy and government needed religion to bolster its claim for human flourishing over atheist communism. Though both American capitalism and Soviet communism were fully secular, ours was on the high ground because it allowed for the freedom of religion. Freedom became a loaded moral phrase that spoke to both separatists and to the religious. And again, look at Dave Rubin. When Dave Rubin talks to Dave Lennox, we're back to the Cold War with Dave Rubin. But Dave Rubin is not fighting godless communists anymore. Dave Rubin is fighting the woke. And so now God is even a comfort for Peter Boghossian. Not that Peter believes in him, but the comfort of communion by fundamentalists who say, Peter, we know how you feel. Our secular age may have led to an intense conflict, yet could we all agree on the importance of freedom, as long as we didn't ask too many questions about what freedom was for and what it looked like? In the 1950s, against the heat of the Cold War, the esteem of the pastor seemed to be gaining, hitting heights it hadn't seen in decades, as, again, the ordinary lives of citizens became essential, never mind that it had more to do with geopolitical victory than salvation. Okay? And now, this is the birthplace of Jordan Peterson's anxiety over the Cold War. Yet when Fosdick had died in October 1969, the end of the progressive period, as says Douthit and Peter Thiel, the importance and esteem of the pastor was about to come under attack it couldn't anticipate. As the South was set ablaze by racial conflict and the new media of television awakened the North to the evil of our national apartheid, pastors cut from the cloth of Fosdick boarded buses outnumbered only by college students. The pastor was the conscience of our secular ordinary lives, working and speaking for human flourishing. There was no place he was needed more than in the South. Not only Kodachrome, it's the radical priest, it's the black pastor, it's the mainline white pastor going down by bus to march with Dr. King in the South. Not only were African Americans in the South not flourishing, but the racists were attacking their ordinary lives, bombing churches and keeping them from diner counters, bus seats, and drinking fountains. Pastor Martin Luther King Jr. may have understood American Protestantism better than anyone else. He had a PhD. Dr. King was a very well-educated man. By staging resistance to the center of ordinary life, again on buses and in diners, he revealed an overwhelming lack of flourishing. Dr. King, you have to understand, was a product of the mainline church, of the white mainline church. Dr. King drew his ideas from Tolstoy, Gandhi, and the mainline church. He revealed an overwhelming lack of flourishing. White mainline pastors couldn't but act. Letter from a Birmingham jail. Read that in this context. Calling on President Kennedy and Johnson in Washington to do the same. You're seeing the groundwork for the woke movement here because these scripts would be followed. But pay attention to the other constituent elements of what the church is. Take a look at what has happened in the mainline church, and if you understand this, it all makes sense. Participation in the civil rights movement would be the last and best victory for the Fosdick-type pastor. In many ways, it would be the very summit, the high point on the line graph, which signaled both the peak and simultaneously the decline of the pastor's influence. And this drop in importance and trust of the Fosdick-type pastor would be steep. In the late 1960s dawned, and a new age of authenticity took root, which we will discuss at length in Volume 1. And Root writing about that is really good. Now notice Rick Warren praised Ed Obama's inaugural, not a mainline pastor, because in a sense, sort of like following Jordan Peterson's read of Nietzsche, where Christianity slits its own throat, similarly, the mainline slits its own throat. And pastors in the mainline are nothing but pastors and evangelicals. They're, in a sense, working the American system. They've got the money and they've got the votes, and that makes them players in a way that mainline pastors, they ain't players. They don't have the votes. As the late 1960s dawned and a new age of authenticity took root, the large youth culture decided that it could not trust the leaders of the societal structures to work for human flourishing. As the blood of 18-year-olds filled rivers in Vietnam, those in power, whether in Alabama or Washington, were painted as fascists, seeking their own power over human flourishing. The whole system was to be labeled corrupt, and to their surprise, too, were the chaplains of the secular age. Organized, particularly Protestant mainline, Fosdick-like religion was now seen as a pawn for the powerful, corrupt of its own right. White mainline pastors, of course, pointed to their work for racial equality. This is sort of like progressive evangelicals saying, we'll affirm the nice gay couple. We won't police sexuality. Love us yet. Sorry, too late to the table. Tony Campolo. But it was too late. Even those pastors who fully embraced the new ideologies, following, for example, the death of God theology, were painted as disconnected and backwards. In the new movement that the baby boomer generation would create, the past would be jettisoned and disestablished with the hope of creating a new society of free love, where human flourishing was not coldly institutional but romantically warm, where ordinary life was from top to bottom completely about freedom, casting off all old conventions. The counterculture provided a new spirituality that promised the freedom of love, sex, and excitement. It was to become a new spirituality of authenticity, where all were free to find their own path to fulfillment by defining for themselves what it meant to be human. No dogmas, no dogmas. Got to get rid of the dogmas. The dogmas are the problem, you fundamentalists. So, ironically, you can see the development of Sam Harris, and it's about love. Rationality says it's about love. I'm not getting that from Christianity. It's just sense. Read Christian Smith. Not only was the devil no longer in the woods, but the sources of meaning, the importance of the rites of passage, and the shape of ordinary life were up to you, and you alone. The age of authenticity was, in no small measure, a new way of engaging the immanent frame of the secular age without overthrowing it or returning it to Edwards or Beckett's days. The world itself was presumed to be only natural and material. There was nothing in the world that was more than this. As we saw in Volume 1, which I haven't seen because I haven't read it, though this didn't mean that there wasn't a search for the spiritual. Hippie use of psychedelics and Eastern religious practices provided a spirituality, but it was a spirituality with no need for a personal God and was therefore bound within the immanent frame. The bohemianism of the late 60s counterculture revealed that few people could stand this immanent frame for human life. Yet, unable and unwilling to overthrow the immanent frame, people sought to discover new spiritual realities within themselves. Now, the individualism, and this is the problem with, okay, we're gonna get out of this organized religion, not to a folk religion like Mama, but to a new religion that's purely authentic. But what they're unable to create is a principality. That's the individualistic definition of spirit. And again, what I would argue is spirit is something that creates principalities, not something that I just feel it in me. People conceded in different measure that the world was only natural and material, but they also believed that it would create our own spiritual meaning for ourselves. So Sam goes off and does, you can go off and do your spiritual thing. You can meditate. You can do all these practices if it gives you the experience of spirituality, but don't let that in the public realm. And that's up to you. And again, it's going to be very difficult to actually create a principality that moves people together within community. The age of authenticity makes the way of being human and therefore the order of ordinary life, or even what is ordinary, multivalent. It became the new spirituality to be unique and not conform. Ordinary, but they're all non-conforming in the same way. Ordinary is now assumed to be as vast as the number of people. It was in this environment that the New Age movement would begin, seeking paranormal, experiential spirituality. Not doing enough psychedelics in the main line, it appears. I had to get to the psychedelic conversation through Jordan Peterson. In Edwards' Day, everyone needed to conform to keep the devil in the woods. And in Beecher's and Fosdick's day, democratic conformity would produce human flourishing. That's the modernist period. That's mass culture. Everyone read Life magazine. Everybody watched Walter Cronkite. A new expressive individualism, Robert Bella, now dawned, which asserted that our own individual ordinary life was your highest good, your best life now, says Joel Osteen. You needed to attend to your own flourishing first. Yeah, and when parents started doing that, kids felt it. The 1980s would be called the me generation. Get into the Douthit Weinstein podcast where Eric can't figure out why the baby boomers aren't handing down their wealth to the next generation. Well, it's going to happen in COVID. The 1980s would be called the me generation. Not only had the hippie countercultural zealots become yuppies or bobos, as we call them in Volume 1, enjoying the excess of consumer society, but also because human flourishing in ordinary life would become an enclosed individual project. The pursuits of flourishing had shifted from keeping the devil in the woods to keeping the machines of urban America moral, to me being happy, flourishing in my own individual life project. An example of this shift, as much as Fosdick supported a liberal theological position, he spoke strongly against... My wife checking on dinner. It's getting late. I got to finish this up. This is an important passage. I don't want to mess it up. An example of the shift, as much as Fosdick supported a liberal theological position, he spoke strongly against divorce. As the chaplain of the secular age, pushing for a societal human flourishing, he couldn't see how completely free choice of sexual partners was good for society. Yet, just downtown, a pastor in a church in the shadow of Wall Street would herald the power of positive thinking, challenging Fosdick as New York's greatest preacher. Each Sunday, Norman Vincent Peale filled his church by giving his people and the hundreds of thousands listening to the radio the tools of self-help, providing ways of flourishing in your individual life project as your ultimate end. This is the church tradition of Donald Trump. The pastor now needed to remake himself or herself as a guru or a sage, able to assist people in the pursuits of their individual flourishing. Rob Bell? Those pastors, particularly in the mainline churches, who didn't take on the guru identity, quivering masses of affirming availability, holding to the clerical conventions of Fosdick or even Edwards, were left behind. They were seen as relics of the past world where we naively trusted the establishment and believed we needed pastors to be our conscience. As flourishing shifted from societal to individual, people were free to find all sorts of ways to experience something spiritual inside the immanent frame. Taylor calls this the Nova effect, meaning that all sorts of third ways between cold immanence and organized religion exploded. These unique third ways provided people with overarching meaning, significance to their rites of passage, and direction in their ordinary lives. It became a new spirituality to exercise. Follow a band, hike, make money, party, swing, or get your kids into Yale. Up against the immanent frame, all these options, this nova effect, infused purpose into individual flourishing. The answer to the meaning crisis is your hobby. But will it hold? Organized religion and its pastors seem too stale and too boring to help. As some pastors reinvented themselves, free of the conventions of organized religion, no longer chaplains of a secular age, maybe they go onto YouTube and become YouTube stars, and no longer mainline liberal, the churches that these mainly evangelical pastors built were void of religious symbols, looking more like malls than cathedrals, fitting more the shape of individuals' ordinary lives of shopping and entertainment than the invitation to sacred space. We are now as far away from Augustine and Becket as we can be. These new churches in suburban America were the height of secular. No time-bending gravity permeating their walls. If you went to Bill Hybels' church when it first started, they had communion on Wednesday night so as not to scare the people they're trying to attract. They looked more like Johnson & Johnson headquarters than the Duomo. But these buildings played an important part in the recasting of the pastor. Now that the Nova effect had hit and spirituality had taken on a multiplicity of options, the pastor needed to make himself, there were few if any women leading these churches, into the entrepreneur and his building a concrete presentation of the product he was offering. The cultural environment was perfect for the shift in pastoral identity. The spiritual markets were unregulated. The hegemony of established religion was done. Mainline Protestant America was over. And yet the age of authenticity and its Nova effect moved people to seek spirituality. The monopolies were broken up, and yet there was spiritual demand. In this perfect environment for the entrepreneur, the model of pastor shifted from Harry Emerson Fosdick to Rick Warren, who started Saddleback in 1980. Warren was uninterested in being the chaplain of the secular age, reminding people of their better gods. Born and raised in California, bathed in the air of authenticity and intuitively but sharply aware of the Nova effect, he formed a church that could speak to those searchings, and in turn provided what many in their new spiritualities couldn't. Warren knew that all of these third ways that people were using to create individualized flourishing promised them purpose by giving them an overarching meaning, ritualizing the passages of time and directing their ordinary lives. Anybody remember the name of Rick Warren's book that sold millions and millions of copies? In many ways is sort of an anthology of Christian cliches that Mama would immediately recognize. The Purpose-Driven Life. 40 Days of Purpose. Rick Warren rode purpose all the way to megachurch stardom. And yet, these new options were often either too loose and undefined or too tight and domineering to provide what people needed, leaving them in a malaise, as Taylor called it. In his California upbringing, Warren had seen both the too open and too closed. He watched classmates follow bands and embrace nature. He rubbed shoulders with members of Jim Jones' People's Temple, which relocated to Warren's Northern California community. Exercise or hiking could take you pretty far, directing your interests and activities and giving you some meaning, but they ultimately could not provide you with enough of a life-directing purpose to overcome your mate. He created a purpose-driven church and provided his people a purpose-driven life. This attention to purpose would have the ability to direct people's ordinary lives by speaking to their individual pursuit of flourishing. Within 25 years, Warren's church attendance ballooned to over 20,000 people in 120 acres in Orange County. Warren called it Saddleback Community Church, deliberately avoiding denominational signals in its name. Warren believed that signaling that this was a Southern Baptist church would turn off seekers of individualized flourishing. Warren's building and his own style represented an openness, even a partnership, in helping individuals find their own purpose by allowing Jesus to help each person flourish and overcome the malaise that the age of authenticity seemed to leave in the wake of its individualized freedom. Yet Warren did not do this by speaking against individualized human flourishing or the age of authenticity. Instead, he doubled down and wagered that Jesus was just the individualized spirituality that could actually fulfill this purpose or this promise. The results seemed to speak for themselves. Soon enough, Warren would create a network of other pastors, helping them take on the purpose-driven entrepreneurial pastor identity he had honed. Warren gave purpose to scores of pastors who had felt lost after the Fosdick-type identity now no longer worked. In the early 2000s, Warren would mobilize these purpose-driven entrepreneurial pastors, launching a new initiative for lay people called 40 Days of Purpose. Its core resource would be the purpose-driven life, showing how directly Warren had his finger on the pulse of the pursuit of individualized flourishing. It was outsold in the first decade of the new millennia only by J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series and Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Warren found a way to revitalize the image of pastor next to the individualized pursuits of flourishing. The pastor as entrepreneur provided a direct way to be in the age of authenticity, offering the option of Jesus in the middle of the Nova effect. But this understanding of the pastor had an inherent problem that leads us back to the pastor I was talking with at the conference, the one with a nauseous, uneasy feeling of what to do. What made Warren's perspective both genius and problematic is that he would offer Jesus at the level of the Nova effect. Jesus was another third option amongst the thousands of others. Of course, Warren was not shy in claiming that Jesus was the best option. A third way could actually deliver in providing purpose and individual flourishing. But once Jesus was a choice in the new market of spirituality, a silent concession to the immanent frame that it could be treated as reality would be confirmed. The immanent frame, remember, is a natural order that asserts that our lives should be considered primarily natural. It tempts us to block any overarching sense of transcendence and of God speaking or holding that there is no difference between sacred and secular, allowing the secular to swallow the sacred. The entrepreneurial pastor's building was the clearest sign that this was indeed a spirituality acquiesced to the immanent frame. There was no sense of sacred time or space. The church building was as secular and utilitarian as an office complex. Rather than an invitation to enter into sacred reality, it presented a place to find the resources to personally flourish, including childcare assistance, counseling centers, support groups, exercise classes, and coffee shops. Ironically, this would make the building essential, for it was the place that held the material resources and programs individuals needed to flourish. And the bigger, the better. 20,000 people allowing for 120 acres, Warren seemed to always talk about them together because in the end, the number of people wasn't as important as the number of acres, and the number of people allowed for the number of acres. Because the larger the campus, the more resources it could provide you as you sought your own flourishing. The more resources, the more you were engaged. The more you were engaged, the more viable the spirituality was within the Nova effect. It could provide meaning, shape your passages through time, and help your ordinary life be one of individually experienced flourishing. As Mark Chavez has shown, churches in America were polarized in the sense of size. Small churches are getting smaller and big churches bigger because the bigger they are, the more resources they offer to tend your malaise by giving outlets for individual flourishing. This yielding to the immanent phrase affirmed that transcendence, divine action, was difficult to imagine. And this difficulty in imagining divine action, as Root puts it, is exactly why the pastor I was talking with at the conference had no idea what to do. The pastors just followed the tradition along, even though he's lived just a tiny little piece of it. He had done a faithful job as pastor. But he had a deep sense that he was supposed to be accomplishing something else, something bigger, that he couldn't. And if he couldn't, he had nothing else to offer in the immanent frame. He had grown his church, but not to the level of Warren, not even too close to being a one-stop shop for all your individualized flourishing. And this meant that there was no way to block the competing pitches of other spiritualities in the Nova. He knew that many of his people found more meaning in all sorts of other spiritualities: vacation, their children's sport, yoga, celebrity, buying, which led him to be inherently frustrated with his people's supposed lack of commitment. He found himself bouncing back and forth from blaming them to blaming himself, always feeling either guilty that he couldn't be a better entrepreneur and grow a bigger church, or frustrated that he couldn't really just commit, that they couldn't really just commit. He explained that he tried for a while to recover the Fosdick type pastoral stance, confronting social justice and marching for human rights, and while in itself it was good and right, he couldn't provide pastoral identity. In other words, he was becoming a community organizer. And, well, you might as well be a community organizer, not a pastor. The full-blown secular age had only skepticism for a chaplaincy, especially after the religious right. He even tried returning to Edwards-like picture of the pastor, recommitting to doctrinal focus on strong, direct preaching of the word. So you had the seeker movement, and after the seeker movement, you had the emergent, and the emergent movement changed really the two main figureheads of the split in the emergent movement are Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell. And you see the two decisions. Driscoll goes back to Edwards, Bell goes to Oprah. So he stood next to me, stuck, feeling a depressing malaise laced in a hot, frustrated insecurity. For this uncomfortable place, he had found the crux of his issue. Looking me in the eyes, he said, "Ultimately, I guess I don't know what to do, because I don't know how to talk about God in a way that people sense and recognize, and I'm not even sure if that's possible anymore." I was that pastor. I've been that pastor many times. That's why I know what this book is saying. But I think it's exactly here that Jordan Peterson walks into the picture. Because what Jordan Peterson did was show God. And this from a man who, he did it intuitively, couldn't really quite articulate what he was doing. Now, one of the things I appreciate about Eric Weinstein is he seems a little bit more focused on institutions, and I think that's helpful. In the West, the church has been eclipsed by its daughter, the university. And so the church has gone on this migration that I think Andrew Root nicely lays out. But Andrew isn't talking about the university. George Marsden, in another one of his books, tracks out the soul of the American university and documents that transition. The university, however, is now in its crisis because the university is undergoing predictable institutional corruption, but in a funny way, the university, like the pastor, doesn't know what it's doing. And what the universities are doing now is basically a step behind the churches, and they are now becoming the mainline church. And if you look at what universities do and the moral codes universities enforce, they're in that position that Andrew Root noted about the mainline. And you can see the conflicts with the 1960s, the different notions of liberty. But the totally secularized flourishing, well, pastors, what on earth would a pastor do? Because all that God talk means nothing. Well, the university, what does the university have? The university has psychology and sociology and economics and the hard sciences and engineering. Surely the university is the locus of what will bring us to the utopia. But what the university can't do is all the stuff that has been excluded when we made the bargain, kind of like Odin, to take out the one eye. And so what eye do you now replace? The woke eye. And the modernists are freaking out because can't we just assume humanism? No, we've deconstructed that. I can't deconstruct my suffering. I can't deconstruct my experience. And so now we're in the age of authenticity, and the university is trapped. On the Discord, on the Portal Discord, I was relating that if you want to look at the crisis of the university and the tyranny of the university, why Jordan Peterson, on a conversation with Ron Dart fairly early on, Ron wanted to talk about Erasmus, who he wrote a book about. I said, no, Peterson is more a Luther. And Weinstein, now here's the thing, you know Martin Luther's name, you might know John Calvin's name, but there are lots of guys around Luther. And Luther's wave was way bigger than Jordan's wave. The wave of the Protestant Reformation against the tyranny of the Roman Catholic Church was enormous. Well, I think the reason Eric Weinstein is coming into his own in the IDW is he's acting more like a Martin Luther now. He's more poorly behaved. He's more willing to risk things. But the overarching philosophical questions remain undone because you can't go into that liminal space where you're sharing the woo. Eric is getting in there a little bit more. Jordan would be in there and take his licks for it. But this is what's happening. And see the Eric Weinstein Duthot conversation when they talked about how the 60s migrated the university. Folk religion. Folk religion remains a potent political force. Much of Trump's support comes from people who have a firm degree of folk Christianity among them. These have been targets of the new atheists. They don't care what you believe. They really care how you vote. Jordan Peterson's sin was giving aid and comfort to such ideas instead of joining in the eradication of it. And this is where Eric is becoming interesting. Oh, I got my minor in folk culture. Oh. Well, this Jesus smuggling is going to get real interesting when you're sort of in the trenches with the folk religious people because, you know, they don't have that woo detection like you got it. They really don't care what the highly secularized, highly educated elites are fearing. And this, of course, opens the door for lots of really conservative religious people like Orthodox and Roman Catholics who still believe in sacraments and other Christian people that still believe in miracles. And this is part of the reason why the IDW is unstable. The left thinks they can substitute economics for religion. That's never going to happen. And in fact, the meaning crisis is the evidence for that. After Tom Brady wins how many Super Bowl rings, been to Disneyland, married a supermodel, what now does this world have to offer? The correlation that we see is basically through the university. Because, well, what happens? Little J.D. Vance grows up and goes to the university and now learns the secular ways. That's how you make people no longer wooey. But the shared foundation for science and morality is Christendom. And Christianity and the institutions and social realities dissipate. Will the morality and the humanism also dissipate? This, of course, is Tom Holland's anxiety. So church and clergy are the canaries in the coal mines. And this is where I think Root's narrative really helps inform the trajectory of the IDW and why Jordan Peterson and this movement can be understood in this narrative. And I think the narrative shows why, even with Jordan in the trough, and sees Eric increasingly behaving badly, looking to take up the mantle. So, should be interesting. And a number of people have said, Paul, what's your project? I don't have this figured out. I haven't written a book. You're watching the rough draft of my project right now. Why are my videos so rambly, so disorganized, so hodgepodgey? It's the way my brain works. These aren't finished issues. We're working out as we go. So, no commercials, no monetization. You shouldn't pay for a rough draft. Anyway, let me know what you think. Not sure how long this is. Could very well be the record.